All right, good morning, everybody. We're going to dive right in. Time will go by quick, and we have just some light material to go over this morning. Welcome to the Secular Dharma Foundation Lecture and Dialogue Series. This is the third one we've done, and I'm very excited to have John Peacock with us this morning. Hey, John, how's it going over there? I know it's not this morning for you, so.
It's not this morning, no. It's very much afternoon here at the moment, about 5 o'clock or so.
Exactly. So today, just so you know what we're going to do, is we're going to talk about the Abhidharma, practical applications of Abhidharma. And we really hope that actually these do have practical applications of this teaching. I'm going to talk for a little while, then John's going to talk for a little while, then I'm going to talk for a little while, then he's going to talk for a little while. I'm going to try to give him the last word because he's a little bit more knowledgeable on the material than I am, so he can perhaps correct any of my misgivings. And hopefully this will be an interesting dialogue for you guys to observe. And then we'll take it at the end. We'll take some questions. We won't record the question and answer period, so that way you can ask whatever question you like and not worry about coming up on YouTube later on. So that's the only part we omit. And so let me take a look at my extensive notes here. So, okay. So the Abhidharma, we're also going to talk about the Abhidharma in its context in the Theravada tradition mostly because a lot of different schools of Buddhism have their version of it, and it would be very complicated to get into all of those. So the Abhidharma is a collection of the Pali Canon. It's considered one of the baskets, as they're called. It did come at a later time. I believe somewhere around the time of King Ashoka and the Third Buddhist Council is when we start to see these ideas emerge in the Abhidharma. So some people, fundamentalists, think, well, it's not really part of the Pali Canon because it came later. But the one thing that I would say about it that I think is really important is whoever came up with it are people who were practicing immediately after the time of the Buddha, which is to say that they're probably pretty sincere practitioners. And the way they came up with this is probably it's a kind of a categorization of some of the teachings in the Pali texts because the Pali texts are not easy, light material to read. So a lot of its theory and application is drawn from the Pali Canon. What it does is it categorizes and almost manualizes mental processes. And so a lot of times it's a little bit confusing because sometimes it's considered to be a study of consciousness. I don't think that's quite the right term, consciousness vijnana. The word that we use, really the entirety of the Abhidharma is a study of what's called chitta, which is also a study of what we could say the third foundation of mindfulness, mindfulness of chitta. And I can say that when you look at the teachings of Satipatthana, the section on chitta is not very long and extensive. And so I have found over the years that having some Abhidharma knowledge has made the practice of the third foundation of mindfulness a lot more rich. For me personally, I found it to be tremendously helpful because it gives us a little bit more of a thorough analysis of the mind processes. The Satipatthana more or less asks us to monitor the presence and the absence of greed, hatred, and confusion, which is fine and helpful, but it's not really enough to give us a sense of what are the real, actually specific aspects of my mind, of my cognition that are causing me suffering, that are causing me affliction. How can I better have a more sophisticated lexicon of terms of is it jealousy? Is it envy? What is it specifically in my mind that's getting in the way of my happiness or my well-being? So we could say, in a kind of secular sense, I think that's kind of a lot of the parallels I draw is we could say that really chitta is the study of not consciousness, but the study of cognition. The mind, as it arises, its functions, its purposes, its applications. And also, we would even go so far as to say, when we think about cognitive science or cognition, we are too psychologized around that. Where the Abhidharma, I would say, also includes not just the cognitive, but the emotional aspect of experience, and also the somatic. The Abhidharma has quite a lot to say about the body, which doesn't always get named. So it's really we could say chitta is mind or mind heart, in a very simple sense, it's kind of the whole damn thing. It's what's going on in my mind, heart, body system as a kind of a holistic, global sense of experience. When you look at the Abhidharma, cognition or consciousness is defined in three basic ways. The first way that it's described is as an agent being kind of that which knows the object. So there's a kind of knowing capacity to it, knowing the in breath as the in breath, knowing the out breath as the out breath, knowing that I have anger in my mind, noticing that I don't have anger in my mind. It's just kind of this basic agent capacity that we learn in preliminary mindfulness practice. This is a lot of what we start to learn. We start to notice what rises up. We maybe have an identification of what it is that rises up. And then we can kind of understand, is this something that I want to cultivate or something that I want to let go of? It also can be understood. Me and John were just talking a little bit about my guitars hanging on the wall, about music a little bit. And also, chitta, conscious cognition, can also be seen as an instrument, which is a function of mind that organizes other mental factors in a way that the world can kind of make sense to us, that things, we understand things. So it has a quality of organization. And also to say this process happens real fast, so it's not always easy to catch. The last way that it's understood is as an activity, which is really that is to say it's the entire cognizing process itself. Um, and it's so much so when you talk about self or anatta, it's not so much what I call myself, what I think Dave Smith is really this chitta process. So there's a way in which we're so identified with that which comes up in the mind, which comes up in our experience. And this is also interesting. It's also marked by impermanence. This is an ever going, ongoing, changing process that comes and go, and it's marked by rising and falling. And I'm sure, as you know, when you start practicing meditation, especially in the Mahasi system, one of the things that we're asked to do is to monitor things arising, things passing away. And we generally use the breath as a way to steady the mind around that. And that allows us to get a sense of the ongoing, ever changing nature of these experiences. And so, just to get a little bit more specific without getting too analytical, perhaps. There's an interesting argument right now in cognitive science. Oh, cognitive science, they always argue about this stuff, which is kind of interesting. But the study, is consciousness or cognition, is it an emergent process or is it a fundamental? Is it just kind of a fundamental thing? And this is kind of new territory that they're exploring. But I think the Abhidharma theory would say that the mind is an emergent process. And that means it's something that rises up, kind of here for a few moments and it passes away. And when we look at consciousness, it's not as, I don't think, elaborate or as important as a process as cognition or chitta is. Consciousness is just that which knows an object. So it's kind of a three-party system. So I have ears, and because I have ears, I don't have my bell on. I can hear things. So we have an organ, and then we have an external object, and that rises up together and creates hearing consciousness, seeing consciousness, smelling consciousness. That's it, really. That's what vijnana is. But chitta is a lot more elaborate. And one of the ways that we can understand it that's really, really helpful is that the the Abhidharma classifies kind of mental events or what they're called chaitasikas, and 52, there's 52 of them. And they're not esoteric things. They're things like attention, feeling, mindfulness, faith, non-hatred, greed, hatred, confusion, a lot of the words that we hear a lot in Dharma practice, they're all kind of listed amongst this thing. And one of the ways that it's explained is that they have four defining qualities to them. And I'll kind of just go through those and pass it over to John. And I'll give you a couple of examples so it doesn't get too theoretical. Is that each mental factor, so let's just use mindfulness because that's a word that we all know. There's a characteristic of these qualities of mind. It's salient qualities, things that we can actually recognize. There's a characteristic to these mental factors. There's also a function. They do something. There's a task associated with this word. Sampati, I believe, is the word that there's a characteristic and it has a task. It does something, and it has a manifestation, which is how it presents itself or how it appears in present time experience. And this is really helpful because this is all to say that you can actually sit and observe these experiences. And so the Buddha's trying to give us, or these thinkers, I shouldn't say the Buddha, whoever these guys who came up with this stuff, are giving us some hints of how we can understand these things. And they also have what's called a proximate cause, or they're dependent upon something to arise. Something else needs to be there. There's something that is going to allow this to rise up. So if we just look at mindfulness, I'll give you a couple of them. Mindfulness is one, sati, this word sati, which is listed in the Abhidharma amongst the beautiful mental factors. So just to say also in the Abhidharma theory, mindfulness is considered a wholesome mental state. It's characteristic. Sati is characterized by kind of a non-wobbling or a steadiness. So sati is able to stay steady or to not wobble on a particular object. So there's a way in which we can stay connected to that experience, and that's one of the ways it's characterized. And we see this when we practice mindfulness. If we are sitting and we attune to the rise and fall of our breath for, a period of time, the mind becomes more steady and we're able to better observe other things that are happening. Things don't appear to be going so quickly. We can actually recognize these functions of mind. And so the function of mindfulness is described as a kind of absence of confusion or a non-forgetfulness, which is, I think, the opposite of mindfulness is probably forgetfulness. So there's a non-forgetting. Maybe we would use even the word recollection here. There's a recollection. We're remembering. Oftentimes mindfulness is related to the word memory. We're remembering the object. We're able to stay steady, and that's what its function is. Its manifestation, I like this one. Its manifestation is kind of as a guardianship. It kind of has maybe even an ethical component here, a kind of guarding the mind, a willingness and ability to confront the object. And this is really helpful if we are sitting and the objects that are presenting themselves are painful or they're upsetting. We see maybe some self-hatred, we see some jealousy, we see some aspects of our psychology that we would rather not actually look at. And instead of diverting away from those, as we tend to do, this is too painful, this is too upsetting, I don't really want to look at this, I don't want to deal with this, I'll turn away from that. Mindfulness, its manifestation is the ability to say, no, actually, let's see if we can be with this experience. And its proximate cause is considered strong perception, a strong perceiving, which is no surprise, developed by practicing the four foundations of mindfulness. So when we're able to practice awareness of the body, of feelings, of mental states, of ideation, when we cultivate satipatthana, we're able to be in the space of mindfulness a little bit more skillfully. And just the last thing to say, I forgot how in depth this stuff gets. One of the things that I found to be very helpful is that when we look at kind of the definition of the path, the Buddha is asking us to abandon unwholesome states of mind and to cultivate wholesome states of mind. And the Abhidharma said it's a little more trickier than that. It's not just either wholesome or unwholesome. There are mental factors that are considered universal. So there's factors of mind that are in every moment of experience, like attention, for example, which is really important. Attention's in every moment of consciousness. Really, all the five aggregates, feeling and perception, they're always there and they're considered ethically neutral. Attention is a non-ethical mental factor. It's just there. So we have these aspects of mind. I think there's seven that are in every moment of experience. And then we have ethically neutral occasional mental factors, which are aspects of mind that are there sometimes. And again, they're not mysterious. They're things like desire. Sometimes there's desire in the mind, and desire in and of itself it's not wholesome or unwholesome. It's just there. Depends on what's rooted underneath it. Things like decision, choice. These are considered ethically neutral. So there is an ambiguous category here. So then we have these universals there in every moment. There's occasionals. These are all ethically neutral. And then we get into unwholesome states of mind. There are considered to be unwholesome states of mind that are in every unwholesome mind state, things like restlessness. Um, and then there's the wholesome ones, the beautiful ones, which are there's a whole range of those at all. So we want to be able to see that it makes it a little bit more helpful to me because I'm not, sometimes I'd be practicing, I'm like, is this wholesome? Is this unwholesome? Sometimes it's neither. I have choices to make. I have desires. I have things that I want. Some of the things I want are wholesome. Some of the things I want, honestly, not so good. And so this gives me a way of working with these things before I get in the binary of wholesome or unwholesome. There's a territory to be explored that has some room for ambiguity. So that's a little bit of analysis of what this is. And I'm going to pass it over to John, and I'm very curious to see what he has to say, or perhaps even correct.
Well, I'm not going to correct you, but I think you've given them the full immersion experience to start with in terms of the material. I want to go back to why should we even be interested in the Abhidhamma? Why should we even be interested in it? I sometimes say if you've got insomnia, pick up a book on the Abhidhamma. You'll pretty well drift off almost after a couple of paragraphs. Um, it's an enormous compendium of work, if you've ever seen it. And saying it's an enormous compendium of work, even the last part of it, the whole thing hasn't been translated adequately, even yet. There's 7 books to the Abhidhamma. They are canonical, as Dave says. And why are they canonical? Basically, because this process of really analysis and categorization starts in the Buddha's lifetime. So if you look through the Pali Nikaya material, the material which we usually call the suttas, if you look through the Pali Nikaya material, you'll find sometimes there are discourses which are given by Sariputta, one of the Buddha's chief disciples. Whenever there is generally, and I'll only give you 2 examples, whenever there is generally something which is full of lists, it's usually by Sariputta. Yeah. So in the Digha Nikaya, in the long discourses of the Buddha, we've got a whole list, which is basically all the lists you ever remember. I call it the list of lists. It's an enormous set of lists about what's most important for you to remember as a practitioner. Another really good one, which is actually in the Majjhima Nikaya, is the Samaditi Sutta, which is the sutta basically translated on right view or appropriate view that one has. And again, it's full of lists and analysis, basically. And so it starts with that kind of categorization of starting to categorize what's going on in the mind. As most of us realize, whenever we sit down to meditate, we're confronted by an enormous amount of material, let alone in meditation, just in ordinary life, we're bombarded sensually with huge ranges of material. Our mental lives are, dare I say it, chaotic a lot of the time, because there's so much material, we can find it very difficult to identify actually what's going on. So this process of analysis starts to identify what's important. In many ways, the Abhidhamma is really classified as kind of Buddhist psychology or Buddhist phenomenology. As a phenomenology or a psychology, it's not like Western psychology. I mean, when people hear the word psychology, I think we're going to go in and look at all the mental processes and basically from a scientific viewpoint, which is disinterested. This is really interested. It's not disinterested at all, because it's saying, here is the material you need to change you. And it's not saying this is a kind of bird's eye view of all of your psychology from a scientific viewpoint, which is a disinterested God's eye view of things. This is saying these are the things you really need to know if you're going to affect change in your life. And so the Abhidhamma does that. And let me take the first book of the Abhidhamma, which is known as the Dhammasangani. And I think the translation of the title, which was translated in the early part of the 20th century by Carolyn Reese Davids, who was one of the principal translators, along with her husband, of some of the early Pali material, she came up with a title for that translation, which is not accurate, but in some ways is completely accurate. Dhamma Sangani literally means the compendium of Dhammas. Scintillating title, as I say. If you're looking for something to send you to sleep, then that's it. But she translates it, and I think this is gets the import of it much more as Buddhist psychological ethics. Yeah. Now that tells you something straight away that there's an interest in what we're doing here. So it's not psychology from this disinterested viewpoint. It's looking from psychology from an ethical viewpoint. You know, what we're trying to do is look at the mind, and as Dave has correctly identified, look at what needs to be developed, what needs to be cultivated in our minds. And to do that, you start off with a process of analysis. You identify those important things in the mind, which either are obstructive, which are called akusala dhammas, or akusala cetasikas, which means basically unskillful, unwholesome, and you don't really need them, but we have a lot of them. And we basically function primarily through those akusala dhammas or akusala cetasikas. The other side of that is, and Dave has already mentioned that there are these kind of things that just have to be there for us to cognize anything. These are universal factors. So we don't get too worried about those because they're ethically neutral. But we do get worried about the akusala. But more importantly, we should be interested in the subhana, what's called the beautiful factors. The subhana factors are the factors that we need to cultivate, to grow, to develop in your experience. They're there in your, if you like, in the continuum of your mental processes. All of these things are here. So if you imagine a soup with a lot of different ingredients, and not a terribly edifying analogy, but if you imagine a soup with lots of different ingredients, some of them are quite nice ingredients, and some of them are not very nice, actually, in this soup. And what we're trying to do is bring out the flavors of the better ingredients and decrease the influence of those, quite nasty tasting things in the background. So, I mean, it's not a very effective analogy, but I hope you see the point. The mind is a soup containing lots of different ingredients, some to be cultivated, and some actually in that cultivation, there is an almost automatic letting go of. So it's not a matter of saying volitionally, we're going to let go of this. I don't know about you, but I've never let go of anything in my life. What I've done is cultivated something else in my mind. So we're not actually, in a sense, shouting at ourselves to let things go. We're saying, what can I cultivate that stops me from cultivating that? So we're switching, if you like, the energetics of the mind from one set of things to another set of things. And that is why it's an ethical, because it actually has an ethical import. And if we know anything about the Buddha's teaching at all, it was about how do we live well and what do we do? How do we live well in our lives and what do we do when we're faced with all the difficult situations that arise in our lives? That's a huge ethical question. There's no simple answer to it, but understanding the nature of our reactiveness or responsiveness to the situations we find ourselves in. So the reactive tendency of the mind is the one that is usually located primarily in our kusala, in these unskillful activities, because they're well known, well embedded, if you like, they're the neural pathways around which our minds normally go. So as a counter, to counter that, we're developing the other aspects. I hope I've tried to convince you, or I hope I've convinced you that the Abhidhamma is worth looking at because it's about that. Another final bit historically, if you look at the suttas, again, I've got them up in my shelf just in front of me here, but if you look at them, they take up quite a lot of wall space, the suttas. They're not systematic at all. There's no real organization, and the organization it is a bit peculiar. I don't know if you've ever noticed that with these things. You've got long ones, short ones, you've got middle length ones, you've got ones organized by numbers, and you've got ones organized by topic. There's no chronology to them, and everything basically is spoken. They're dialogues, as you well know, or at least discourses which are given in relationship to certain people or certain events. And they are very specific to those particular people who are being spoken to, either, the bhikkhus, primarily the bhikkhus, sometimes individuals, mostly Brahmins of Indian society. And yet, it's very difficult to find your way through that morass of material and find what we call a system within it. Yeah. So, in the Buddha's lifetime, what started to grow up through people like Sariputta and through others, and it was a process that did start in the Buddha's lifetime because the earliest book of the Abhidhamma is something called the Pugala Panyati. The Pugala Panyati is basically translated as human type. So it's human, if you like, psychological types. And it's a very small book in comparison with most of the Abhidharma books, but it started to categorize people. And what were they driven by? Were they the greed type? Were they an aversion type? Were they an intellectual type? And so it started to try and categorize people by psychological types. And it grows out of that whole process. That's where the Abhidharma really starts to come to life in that process. So what it does is it decontextualizes. It takes all those things that happen in contexts where the Buddha gives a discourse to somebody, sometimes with technical terms, sometimes not with technical terms. But the Abhidharma takes those discourses and tries to create, if you know, an overarching system. Having been in teaching for a long time, I know that there's often gaps in the things that you say and things you think, oh, I'd like to have said that. And there are gaps in the Buddha's teaching. For example, processes he doesn't describe. And the Abhidharma attempts to fill in some of those gaps in the Buddha's teaching as well. The word Abhidharma just means higher Dharma, by the way. Yeah. One final comment, and I'll pass it back to Dave, because that's my intro, by the way, to this. That often we're confused because we have actually, even in translations, we have something which we call the Dhamma or the Dharma, and we have dharmas and dhammas. Yeah, have you come across this? One usually with a high case and one with a lower case in it. And people are often confused because one usually is pluralized and one is singular. The big D, the capital D, is dharma, and the little d is dhammas, is pluralized. And people often wonder because actually the Abhidharma is about both the Dharma in this big sense and the Dhammas. Now, I want to say just a little bit about that because it's important. The Dharma, I'm going to use a Sanskritized version if it's easier. The Dharma purports to be an exposition of the way things are. Yeah. There's something both descriptive and in the Buddha's teaching prescriptive about that. So if one starts to understand, for example, through the three characteristics of existence, that things are impermanent, they are dukkha, and they're not self, that's a description. That's part of the Dharma, the descriptive capability of this sense of laying out for how things really are. And the prescriptive part about it says if you really understand that, if you really understand even those three characteristics and everything that arises from them, you live in accordance with it. Yeah, that's the prescriptive part. Yeah. The Dhammas, this little d, there's no such distinction made, by the way, in Pali and Sanskrit between uppercase and lowercase. It's all the same. Yeah. The Dhammas are actually an analysis of what goes to make up the way things really are. So if there's the Dharma as an overarching descriptive, prescriptive aspect of it, of our view, if you like, of reality, then the Dharmas are, if you like, an explanation of what goes up to make up that reality. And for the Buddha, not exclusively, and Dave referred to this because there's an awful lot about material processes. But a majority of what our world consists of is mental processes. And so the Dhammas, as they're laid out in the Abhidhamma, the higher Dhamma, is an analysis of all of those processes Um, and the first part of it is analytic, and people get hung up on the analysis and they forget the last part because everything that's analytic is there to break things down and show that there's no unitariness to things. They're composite, and as composite, they're impermanent. Okay, fine. Where does that leave you and I? Well, we're persons, we're individuals in a sense. Um, And what it really says is to get that sense of how this analysis affects us is really to engage in not just the analytic process, but a synthetic process as well, to show how it works together to make up the beings that we are. Yeah, so it's those two dimensions, that analytic process, you break it down and then you put it back together again. Sometimes Western science, by the way, just breaks things down. It doesn't put them back together again. And what the Abhidharma attempts to do is put things back together, and that's the final part of the seven books of the Abhidharma. It's called the Patana, and the Patana is a work which is the synthesis of everything that's gone before. There's one peculiarity that isn't involved in that, but most of it is about, here are all the stuff that makes us up, and here's how we put it all back together again in processes. So we're looking at processes. And it's just worth thinking about that the Buddha is always analyzing processes. The Abhidharma is about processes. And if you think of yourself and your own life and why it's important to you, is we are processes. Each one of us, you and I, are processes. And that's why we can affect change. We're going to change anyway, whether we do anything about it or not. We're going to get old and all the rest of it, and our habits are going to modify and change over the course of our lifetimes. But this is about directed change. So it says by understanding this process, you can understand how you can affect it and how you can change it in the direction that you want to change it, hopefully towards the Sobhana, towards these beautiful factors, which includes the sati that Dave has already mentioned. The non-wobbling bit, by the way, that Dave mentioned, is one of my favorite words in Pali. Just try this out in your own personal space. It's called upalapana. It's a beautiful sort of labial sound. Upalapana, and it means non-wobbling, not drifting away, and also learning. Actually, that's one of the other dimensions of it. So you don't just engage for mindfulness to steady the mind, you engage to learn something by not drifting away from the object that you're looking at. Enough. Back to Dave.
Thank you, John. John has reminded me to put my fire hose down. And uh, and he really kind of teed me off for what I want to talk about next, and why should we be interested in this stuff? I was very lucky. About 12 years ago, I took a course. I was living in Nashville, and I took a course at the Berry Center for Buddhist Studies on Abhidharma with a really brilliant guy that John also knows named Andrew Olinsky. And one of the things that helped me with Olinsky, he kind of taught me before you even read this book, here's how you could even think about this. And it changed my practice in a meaningful way. I actually probably, much of my meditation practice is probably rooted in Abhidharmic thought to the point where I don't even know that anymore. And I like this, John talking about the Dharma, sort of big D, little d. And this is sort of just a philosophical way to think about it, is I believe that the Buddha this is why I don't like later schools of Buddhism, is he's kind of a non-ontological thinker. We get into this stuff with later schools of Buddhism, the ultimate nature of reality, everything is essentially empty, or there's all these different ways in which there's a tendency, I think religion has this tendency to want to reduce things to some fundamental experience. I think that the Abhidharma pushes back against that kind of thinking. It's not ontological. There's no essence. Ontology is a study of essence. The Abhidharma is a study of process, of things coming and going. And one of the shifts that's made in Dharma is it's kind of taking a noun and making it into a verb. A Dharma is what it does. Something is what it does, which is really kind of an important idea because, we could say, well, what is mindfulness? And we have all these kind of clumsy definitions. Everybody has their clumsy definition of mindfulness. I have plenty. What mindfulness is is fine, but what it does is much more interesting. What does it do? It gives me clarity into the inner workings of my mind. It gives me insight into my behavior. It gives me insight into how my behavior leads to consequences. Some of those consequences are good, some of them are not so good. It's this learning thing. It gives me the opportunity to live my life in a contemplative way. That's what it does. It's like we could say, well, what is water? Well, water is H2O. It's two part hydrogen, one part oxygen. Who cares? What does water do? Well, water allows life to live. Water allows me to grow grass. It allows me to grow a garden. What it does is so much more important than what it is. And I think that there's a way in which we can use this Abhidharmic thought to really be kind of more interested in how these processes play out, how we can become aware of what's going on within our inner life. So that was a helpful distinction for me to make is what is kindness? Well, kindness is, we could say what does it do? Well, it brings me into contact with other people. It helps me with my judgment. It allows me to see worthiness in other people. It allows me to do a lot of things. So, as much as, and I'm really glad that John ended with it, there is a descriptive component to the Abhidharma. There is a way in which these things can be described, which is helpful. I kind of pointed out those four, but then understanding what they do kind of puts the mind into a tool-oriented way of thinking. How can I use this? How can I use this? And how can I use this for what purpose? The purposes of liberation. And I think that what we're trying to do with the goal, the project of the Buddhist project is to liberate the chitta by cultivating these wholesome, beautiful states of mind. And usually, one of the things that's happened over time is I think it's safe to say, and it's probably part of the American overlay, is with Buddhism has kind of become wisdom obsessed. And that's why I'm really glad that John pointed out the ethical. I actually have the little red book here, the Reese Davids book. It's called A Buddhist Manual of Psychological Ethics, which is a little bit more exciting than other ways to say it. So there is an ethical dimension to this, and I think that's really important. There's a way in which we're living, and when we become wisdom obsessed, we're too obsessed with knowing. We're too obsessed with the description of things, which I'm not kicking that out. There is an aspect of knowing these terms and these things and how things are described. There's value in that. And so there's that panya vimutti, liberation through wisdom. But then there's really chitta vimutti, which is that word again, chitta. How do we liberate through the heart, through not just recognition, but really how we can relate to these experiences? And one of the ways in which mindfulness and an Abhidharmic point of view can be very, very helpful, was really helpful to me, is when you get a classification of terms, like shame is in the Abhidharma, and it's actually listed under the ethical, the beautiful side of things, which is really interesting. But we see things, and I'm sure you've all been there. When you meditate, you see things in your mind that you're not really thrilled to see. You see hatred, you see jealousy, you can see contempt, you see a lot of different things. And when we can break the way of seeing that as a feature of myself, but actually a manualized version, you're like, oh yeah, the Buddha was right. There is hatred in the mind. These things are in the mind. It allows us to be, one of the things that it's allowed me to do is it's allowed me to be very honest with myself about the things that I see inside my own mind, and being able to look back at a reference list and go, yeah, the Buddha said that was in here. We can see these experiences for what they are. It depersonalizes them in a way that I find to be very helpful. And so, in this sense, we can use a little bit of, rather being a binary around it, there is the wisdom dimension of mind, which is maybe about knowing or recognition, which is maybe learning some of these teachings, learning some of these theories, which has value. But then there's the chitta vimutti side of it, of being able to not just recognize it, but change the way that I relate to it. And ultimately, for me, it's really about befriending the mind. And not thinking that, for those of you who work with me one on one, which is quite a bunch of you, is that not getting into Dharma practice with the idea that the goal of the practice is to solve the problem of me, and that fundamentally I'm a problem, and I'm broken, or whatever we think about that. And we think that this aspect of practice is going to fix. And I think that word fix gets in everybody's in everybody's way. And then so when we start to see dimensions of our mind, we start to recognize things in our experience that we want to quote on fix, and we just get in denial about those things. We push away from those things. We don't learn anything. I didn't know that apalapana was the non-wobbling. I'm really happy to learn that today because I like that word a lot. It's like, what are we learning? So there's a way in which we can use the Abhidharma to really learn about the mind experience. And so we can think about this as this kind of emergent process that we can kind of come into contact with and really relate to our experience in a different way. And I think getting away from the ontology is helpful because it's very fundamental, this believing that there's a term that you probably know, people use it in Dharma circles all the time, Yata Bhutan, which is, the Dharma is, John pointed to this, the understanding of how things are. Well, things aren't, there's no such thing as how things are, how things work. How do things come into being? How do things arise? Trying to see the interdependent nature of things and trying to get away from this thinking that somehow things are fundamentally a certain way, which is kind of how it gets presented in later schools. And that always sort of bothered me because I've always, and up until this day, I still continue to see aspects of my mind that I'm not so thrilled about or happy to see. I think there was one thing else I wanted to add, but it's not coming to mind right now. So I'm going to hand it back over to John and let him speak more about this. So thank you, everybody.
Okay, well, I'm going to pick up on where Dave left there, which is it's not just about how things are. I'm going to make a horrible, ugly English bit out of this. It doesn't sound very elegant, but it's actually more about how things are-ing, you know, because they're not fixed. Just our very nature of language fixes things. It pins them down. Most of our language is naming. It's interesting when you look into the languages, the canonical languages of Buddhism, there's an awful lot of verb formations in that. So it's not about trying to fix things in that way. The problem is when you've got something material like the Abhidharma, even that starts to fix things to a certain degree. So we get these lists and lists and lists. And one has to remember, of course, that the lists were mnemonical devices for remembering things. That's how we remember things in a basically a pre-written culture, although writing was growing up in the time of the Buddha. In a pre-written culture, it's the way you remember. You remember things through lists. You've got a good list. I mean, in my own training, it's all served me very well because I've just got to get the list and I've got something I can teach. I don't have to go through, well, what shall I? Well, I'll look it up and, look at stuff. You've got it there to hand, literally. And that's what the Abhidharma does. So it starts off from simple lists and the lists get more and more complicated. But primarily what it's interested is in this process that we call mind. And I think it's probably time for me to introduce a little bit more of the technical side of what's going on here. Because one of the analyses that the Abhidharma engages in and says that there is not just the process of chitta. Chitta itself, which we can translate in a number of ways. I mean, it's not an easy word to pin down in either Pali or Sanskrit. But the word chitta can mean something like consciousness or mind. Yeah, that's the primary definition of it. Vijnana, for example, always means consciousness. And it's primarily used in those contexts, although they do move around a bit. But chitta generally has a slightly more ambiguous feel to it. And so it can refer basically to the process of consciousness. And that process of consciousness and that continuing process of consciousness, which we see, got to close my eyes and not even think, I see a process going on, and that's what we call our minds. Yeah. So there's the arising and passing away that they referred to in his introduction. There's a rising and passing away. However, it's not just a rising and passing of a pure consciousness. It's a consciousness which, in a sense, has a flavor to it, or certainly a coloration to it. Now, Dave very quickly went through certain categories. So, for example, for us to perceive and engage in cognitive, events at all, certain things have to be present which support that consciousness. Yeah. Those are what he was calling universal factors. And universal factors are things like rasa, contact, feeling tone, Vedana, for example, perception, which is actually discrimination as much as perception. It's a way of discriminating a world, which is sanya, volition, Chaitana, one-pointedness, which seems strange because many of you will have probably come across this idea of one-pointedness in relationship to meditation, and particularly jhana type meditation, where it's often seen as the end goal is something called ekaggata, total one-pointedness. Whereas actually saying, even just in the process of perception, you have, in what I call perceptual experience, you have a degree of one-pointedness even in that. You have what I call mental vitality as well. There's terrible translations of this, but it's a mental vitality. It's called Jivat Indriya. Jivat Indriya is that which is how vital is your mind at this moment, for example? You could ask yourself the question. Yeah. How vital is it? Is it really engaged or is it sort of dull, lethargic? But it's got to be there. If it wasn't there, you would be kind of comatose. You'd be keeling over. So it's got to be there at sort of minimal level. And then there is the attentive faculty, manasakara. Now, I've gone through those very quickly, but those 7 factors actually are there, present, they're impersonal, they are ethically neutral, as Dave has already said, and they just have to be there. You wouldn't have a world if you didn't have those processes going on. You don't have a choice in them, in other words. So when we take something, for example, like contact and Vedana, the first 2 that are listed here, these 2 aspects are not optional. Everything that you experience comes, for example, with 3 tones of experience. It's either pleasant, it's unpleasant, or it's neither. And that comes through a contact with something. And you don't have a choice in that. This is not about emotion. This is just, does it come to you as pleasant? Does it come to you as unpleasant? Or does it come to you as neither? It's impersonal. If you looked at the Pali that usually describes this, all the verbs that are used in this are completely impersonal verbs. So if you like, personhood doesn't start to get built in till later. Any idea of person, I'm not talking about self, but the sense of us being a person doesn't get built in with characteristics, doesn't get built in till later. So those 7 factors are known as cetasikas, mental factors. In other words, they're what are supporting your basic perception and experience of a world through consciousness. One of the big discoveries that was there right from the early start of Buddhism that the Buddha makes is there is no consciousness without an object. The kind of teachings that were around, which are mainly Upanishadic teachings at the time of the Buddha, said there was kind of consciousness there, and it was like a big, I don't know, screen on which you projected the world. And that was consciousness. So the projection was unreal because it was flickering and moving and all the stuff when you go to the cinema. You go to the cinema, you watch something reflected on a screen. What's left when the cameras, when the projector's been switched off, or whatever they use these days, when the projector's been switched off, is the screen, and that's your consciousness. And the Buddha goes, no, that's not the case at all. The world and consciousness are a co-arising. They come together. They arise together. And all those 7 universal factors are the ones that are involved in that co-arising. So first of all, you have to have contact. That's your initial start, if you like. I have contact. And the way it's described in the Pali text is the world arises through the friction that's created by contact. So what Dave was saying about that sense of an emergent process is exactly what the Buddha is saying. So all consciousness is what's called intentional. That doesn't mean purposive. It just means it has an object and it only arises because of an object. Okay, so that's your minimal basis for that. You have the occasional factors. I'm not going to go into those. They're just things that happen occasionally. They're not there ever present. As Dave said, our desire, for example, which is one of the occasional factors, and it's a good one to look at, again, is ethically variable, you know, depends on the object that my desire is directed at. So, for example, there is something called Dhamma Chanda, which is the desire to understand the Dhamma, for example. But I could have just ordinary desire that's directed at the new car or whatever it may be. You know, that is, if you like, the sort of more unethical variety of it. So it's Janus faced in the sense it looks in two directions. It can be directed at something which is ethical or something which is unethical or ethically, sort of slightly suspect in these ways. And all of those occasional factors are like that. All those occasional factors have that ethical variability about them. So desire is a very, very good one. So when we hear the word desire, don't always hear it as bad. Look at what you're directing it at. Yeah. So that's the occasional factor. Then we get to the interesting part because, we've got those seven factors which have to be there with for the arising of consciousness, for the arising of our world. Let's put it that way. It's an easier way to think about it. The arising of experience, conscious experience, and then we have all the other colorations which are going on. So imagine this. And it's actually not my example. It's an example that Buddhaghosa uses in a very Abhidharmic text called the Path to Purity or the Visuddhimagga. And the Visuddhimagga, he talks about putting dye into water. You drop, I don't know, a bit of red dye into water. What happens? It starts to color the water. Yeah. Put another dye in with a different coloration. That also will stain it and color the water and create a different coloration. Put more in and more in and more in, and you get this cloudiness arising in the mind. Because obviously the water is, if you like, is a simile. It's like the mind. Water innate by its nature is clear, but it's colored by what you add to it. And the Abhidharma perspective is basically asking you, as does actually that element of the Satipatthana Sutta, it says, what's coloring your mind at the moment? Yeah. Now, there's no simple answer to that. I hope you can see that because there might be a dominant coloration, but what's the sub-colorations, if you want to put it that way? What's the minor colorations which are going on and affecting that? Because all of those colorations are affecting what we call your loka or world. And the world is your world of experience. How is it affecting that? Yeah. So let me go back to the Abhidharma version of this. If I have these processes which are supporting, conscious experience, and I drop a little bit of dye of anger in, it's clearly going to color it. Yeah. If I drop a little bit of compassion in, it's going to color it differently. Yeah. Now, that's a very simplistic way of looking at it because actually it's far more complex than that, as we well know. You haven't got just one coloration being dropped into your mind. You've got myriads of others all emerging, coloring your mind, creating your world, creating either, if we move towards the Sabana factors, a degree of responsiveness or reactivity, usually if they're through the unskillful, unwholesome factors which are coloring the mind. So why is the Abhidharma important? Because it's a map of all that. Yeah. Now, in the UK here, we have something which are called ordnance survey maps, which are really quite detailed maps of basically Britain. They're really detailed. They've got all the contour lines and they've got churches marked and, sort of water and everything else. So you could get a pretty good feeling for the landscape, but it clearly doesn't delineate everything that's in there. You know, no map is going to map everything. And the Abhidharma is that like that because it's saying, just like the Ordnance Survey map or whatever your equivalent in the States is it's actually detailing out what you need to know. It's not trying to detail out everything. It's saying, what do you need to know to get from A to B, to get from bewilderment to non-bewilderment? And that could be a synonym for awakening. You're bewildered and confused. What does the map help you to do? It helps you to find your way around a landscape that you don't know very well. You might live in an area, but not really actually perceive all the various contours and the way the land is formed and what things are there. You know, I've certainly myself been in situations like that where I've discovered things I didn't even know were there, and they're sort of quite local here, and not until we get the map. And so, what the Abhidharma is a map. It's a map of your processes. It's a map of your mind. You can get fixated on the map. That's the history of Buddhism, basically. They got fixated on the map. Yeah. There's often this quotation with regard to Western philosophy that Western philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato and Aristotle. Well, actually, the history of Buddhism is a series of footnotes to the Abhidharma. Yeah, because it was trying to make something out of it, either which it was not and take it in directions it was never intended to go, or people just got so interested in the map, they got kind of, I don't know, self-absorbed in it. Now, as a useful meditator's map, and that's the way to really think of the Abhidharma, it gives you a way of orienting yourself to your processes, to finding your way around something which is you can't say any more familiar than your own mind, and yet somehow it's not familiar, is it? That's something I think we nearly all of us discover when we start this process we call meditation, is that we start to discover things about aspects of our mind that we didn't know were there. Or, even in ordinary life, we get things coming out of the wings almost, and you don't know, where that's emerged from. What the Abhidhamma is trying to do is give you a clue how that's occurring, why it's occurring, and show us what we need to cultivate. Gosh, I've said too much. I should stop.
And we have a couple more minutes. I like what you're saying. You wanna open it up and shift a little bit, or do you wanna? Is there more you want to
No, do
add?
you want to take it in another direction? I'm quite happy. I mean, I can go into more detailed
Of course.
aspects of it because I think this stuff, I mean, I might say something on the back of what I've just said, which is this stuff really only starts to come to life when you inject your own understanding of your own processes into what you see in this map. For example, one, if we had time to talk about it, I would talk about quite a lot, and Dave's already mentioned it, is kind of the fourth thing on the list of skillful or beautiful factors is shame as its normal translation. Yeah. And yet in the West, that's got a really bad press, isn't it? You know, shame is something actually we really shouldn't have. It's not something, and yet when we start to think about it and analyze it in the ways that the Abhidharma encourages us to do, we begin to see why it's important and why actually it's not just shame, it's actually, I almost even find this really difficult to translate this other word, which is the shame is hiri in Pali, and the other term is otapa. Otapa means consideration for others or something like that. You know, whereas hiri, rather than shame, we could translate as self-respect. Those two, in other lists, for example, um, other parts of the Abhidharma are referred to as the two guardians of the world. Yeah. They're the two guardians of the world. You can trace it back to the numerical discourses and find those two listed in the numerical discourses. So again, it's not an invention of the Abhidharma. The Abhidharma have imported it and put it there starkly and said, these are the two guardians of the world. Yeah. Why? Because they're ethical factors. Now, you could say that and means nothing to you. So you actually have to think your way into why would these be ethical factors? Why would they alter your behavior? Why would a sense of shame, um, or in my translation, self-respect, be important to you? Now you've started to use the Abhidharma rather than just have it as a list. So you've got to think your way into it. And this is true of each of the others. And you can do it through the ways that, Dave was talking about through functions and all the rest of it. But you've really got to look at it within your own life and think your way into it. Then it comes to life. Otherwise, it's sort of kind of almost like a dead artifact that you're just looking at. It's just a set of lists. And they say, insomnia, wonderful. But, there's a bit more important than that. So we try to use it in a way whereby it comes to life. I mean, I remember teaching at BCBS in Massachusetts, and I did a whole course exactly on that. Basically, Abhidharma was a way of life rather than just a set of categories, because that is the way to bring it to life rather than just have it as this dead, dry artifact, which is actually quite uninteresting if you just leave it at that. But if you're prepared to work, then it connects with what you're doing. It connects not just with your meditation, because remember, this is not just about meditation, it's about your daily life. It's what you do. And that's the really important part about it. Dave, I'll hand back to you.
I'm glad you brought up Hiri and Ottappa because I think they're super important. I just want to reframe something that makes it a little bit more. And I think I've heard this from you, but I know that like Hiri, or the shame or the self-respect is really how I see myself in my own eyes.
Yes.
Right. And so for me, in a kind of colloquial sense, we could say that, like, for me, I really think that how I see myself in my own eyes and how I live from that place can be measured in kind of authenticity.
Mm.
And then the second one, Ottappa, is maybe how other people see me. And sometimes people might see us as genuine. And so I think the goal is to really be aligned in that way. Sometimes people might think I'm a genuine person, but in my own eyes, I sort of know I'm not.
Mm.
But there's a way in which, and I think John Suchito talks about of conscience and concern,
Yeah.
shame having a sense of conscience, a kind of like, I'll even considering like, should I do this? Should I not do that? That would be, it's a way it does. I think it brings us into the contemplative domain of these ideas.
I mean, what you're saying is an extremely important dimension of this, because this business of the way that you see yourself. So let's take. Okay, let's divide these two up. And this is just an example. This is not meant to be the whole of the Abhidharma. It's just an example of two mental factors and why you should develop them. And they have to be developed together. Yeah. And neither of them makes you completely right in your actions, but they have to be balanced in a sense of dialogue with each other in your life. So, if you like, another way of looking at Hiri and the way that you look at yourself in your own eyes, there's certain things that you wouldn't do that in your life, not because your society says you shouldn't do them, but you would just feel unethical about doing those. You could, take a wartime situation. You might be inducted into the services to go there, and yet you actually say killing is completely something I find abhorrent. I would feel ethically defiled by engaging in that. You know? Now, actually, the fact that a government would say to you, you can be conscripted into the army and you've been compelled to fight and possibly kill somebody makes it ethically okay. No, it doesn't. In your own eyes, it does not make it ethically okay. So it's actually, how do I view myself if I engaged in that? How would you view yourself? And you have to, mine's an obvious example, but think of something in your own life that you wouldn't transgress in your own life, yet your society might go, it's not too bad. It's not a big problem and that, but you might say, yeah, actually it is. I wouldn't want, I would feel ashamed in my own eyes if I did that. Yeah. So everybody has to really think of their own examples. What would be something, if you like, the red line that you wouldn't want to cross over in your own life. And that's considered to be a very positive thing. That there are certain things in your life you say no. There's no equivocation about it. You just say no to it. I wouldn't want to go over that line without feeling somehow debased by transgressing that. Now, the thing about the standard translation, which isn't wrong, by the way. I mean, it's we have to nuance it. The whole idea of shame is that it's instantaneous. If you do transgress it, you feel it immediately. Yeah. And so I don't know if you're aware of this, but no Asian languages, any of the ones I know, for example, have a word for guilt, but they have lots of words for shame. And the difference between the two is that one is historical. Guilt is something you carry with you over a long period of time. As we know, we can feel as guilty as we did, 20 years ago about having done something or said something, and possibly even more guilty now than I did then. So it's historical. It's something like baggage we carry with us. Shame is immediate, and it actually says to you, what can I learn at that moment? The next moment is another opportunity not to do that same thing. Yeah. So it's actually asking you, can I learn from this situation? Now, the Otapa part of it is really about social conformity. As a society, we live with others. To get on with others, we have social rules. If you like, a morality. You probably know the origin of the word morality. It comes from mores, social mores, things we agree to. Different societies have different social mores. If you go to a Middle Eastern country, they'll probably have quite different ones, say from liberal Western values and ways of organizing their society and living by. So morality is socially confined. It's about really getting on with others, as much as anything else, doing the things that others would judge you by. So, as Dave was rightly saying, it's how others see you, not how you see yourself. So I don't do certain things, not because I don't want to do them, it's because I don't want to be seen to be doing them a lot of the time. Yeah. Because others will judge me in those cases. Um, Yet there are dangers to both. Yeah. We couldn't be, if you like, I hesitate to use the word authenticity, although I know Dave's used it. I'd hesitate to use the word authenticity here because what we would say is the totally authentic person remains trapped in adolescence.
Guilty as charged.
I mean, that's what it means, isn't it? You think of all the kind of 18-year-old kids. I remember when I was, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do what everybody else, all those adults are telling me to do. And that, so you're kind of rebelling and thinking of yourself as authentic and ethical because you're doing that. Now, that's the worst case scenario. Think about the other case scenario. What's the person who's totally moral? Well, they're totally conformist,
Yeah.
totally conformist. If it's a totalitarian society, you go down the road of conformity because that's what the government says is right, of that particular period. So I mean, there's some very startling images used in Abhidharma material, about this, about in the commentaries, for example. One says, for example, in relationship to Hiri, it's like a ball smeared with excrement. You know somehow if you touch it, you're going to be defiled by it. The other is likened, Otapa is likened often to a red hot ball. You don't want to pick it up. Yeah. You just don't want to pick it up. It's different. You get burnt by it, but it's not as defiling as the other. And what the Abhidharma is suggesting in our ethical lives is we need both of these to counterbalance each other. So ethically, I might be saying I can't do this, but I might be wrong. Morally, it might be acceptable to do this, but it may be wrong. And it's saying, actually, to live an ethical life, I've got to negotiate both of those spheres. And that's why it's important in this area. So it's basically giving a psychological basis for ethics. And then you combine it with all the other factors which are involved as well, which are about doing, not about just hearing.
Thank you, John. We're going to open it up. Just a couple announcements. If you want, these series are offered freely, but if you feel compelled, you can make a donation to the Secular Dharma Foundation at the link in the chat. And one thing just to say, because I know this is a lot of material, one thing that's helped me is you can think about Abhidharma as like mathematics. You don't need to learn it all. But if you can add, subtract, multiply, and divide, which is about all I can do in Abhidharmic theory, that's actually a lot. So I hope that you've gotten the message. It's not to be overwhelmed by this stuff, but to see that it has actual, very practical implications.